The Secret of Hollow Creek. The Caldwell family lived alone in Hollow Creek, Kentucky. Their big farmhouse sat at the end of a dusty dirt road, hidden behind tall oak trees that looked like guards watching over them. People in town stayed away from their place. Those who did visit came back with strange stories about the Caldwell property. In the summer of 1947, a young newspaper reporter named Thomas Reed came to Hollow Creek. He had just finished college and worked for the Louisville Courier Journal. Thomas wanted to write important stories that would make him famous. While he was writing about coal mining problems in eastern Kentucky, he heard weird rumors about the Caldwell family. People said the Caldwells never got older. They said the children stayed young for way too long. They said the father should have died years ago but still worked his farm like a strong young man. Most folks thought these were just silly mountain stories. But Thomas Reed was different. He saw this as the story that could make his career. Thomas looked at his car clock. It was 4:17 in the afternoon as he drove down the dirt road to the Caldwell farm. The sun came through the thick tree branches and made patterns on his windshield. The radio got fuzzy with static as he went deeper into the valley. Perry Como's smooth voice disappeared under the crackling noise. Thomas turned off the radio and rolled down his window. The summer heat was terrible. The air felt thick and sticky, smelling like honeysuckle flowers. Cicadas made loud buzzing sounds in the trees. The only other sounds were his car tires on the gravel road and his camera equipment moving around on the passenger seat. When the road curved to the right, Thomas could see the Caldwell farmhouse. He slowed down to look at it better. The two-story house was old but well-kept. The white paint had turned yellow with age. A big porch went around the front with rocking chairs and hanging plants. Smoke came from a stone chimney even though it was hot summer weather. What caught Thomas's eye was the family sitting on the porch. From far away, they looked normal, a man and woman who seemed about 40 years old, and 3 children of different ages. The man was tall and wide-shouldered, wearing work clothes and a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves. The woman had on a flowered dress with her dark hair pulled back. The children, 2 boys and a girl, were playing some kind of jumping game on the porch steps. Thomas parked his car under an oak tree and got his notepad and camera. As he walked toward the house, the family stopped what they were doing and turned to watch him. Their faces were hard to read from far away. The cicadas seemed to get louder in the sudden quiet. "Good afternoon," Thomas called out, waving his hand as he reached the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm Thomas Reed from the Louisville Courier Journal." The man on the porch nodded slowly but didn't say anything. Up close, Thomas could see the man was older than he first thought. Maybe in his late 50s instead of 40s, with deep lines around his eyes and gray mixed in his hair. There was something strange about those eyes, Thomas thought. They seemed to know things far beyond the man's years. "I was hoping I might talk with you, Mr. Caldwell," Thomas continued, suddenly feeling unsure. "About your family." "Joseph Caldwell," the man said finally, his voice deep and strong. "And what exactly do you want to know about my family, Mr. Reed?" Thomas didn't know what to say. He couldn't just blurt out that he came to check rumors about people who never aged. "I'm writing a story about traditional farming families in Kentucky," he lied smoothly. "Folks who've kept to the old ways despite all the changes since the war. I heard the Caldwells have been working this land for many generations." Joseph Caldwell's face stayed blank. But the woman, who must be Mrs. Caldwell, stepped forward. She was beautiful in a timeless way, with high cheekbones and clear, smart eyes. "We don't like having our business in the newspapers," she said, her voice soft but firm, "especially when reporters come with stories already half-written in their heads." Thomas felt his face get hot with embarrassment. "Ma'am, I promise you." "You've heard things about us," she interrupted. "That's why you're here. Not for some article about farming." The children had stopped playing completely now and stood behind their parents. The oldest boy, who looked about 12, stared at Thomas in a way that made him uncomfortable. The younger boy and the little girl, maybe 8 and 6, whispered to each other behind their hands. Joseph Caldwell sighed heavily. "Eleanor," he said to his wife, "maybe we should hear the man out." He turned to Thomas. "You might as well come inside, Mr. Reed. Seems like we have things to discuss." Thomas followed the family into the farmhouse. The screen door creaked shut behind him. Inside was cooler than outside, but still warm. The hardwood floors shined in the late afternoon sunlight that came through lace curtains. The furniture was simple but well-made. A large oak dining table with matching chairs, a cabinet full of blue and white dishes, and a grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. Eleanor Caldwell pointed for Thomas to sit at the table while she went to the stove where a kettle was starting to whistle. "Tea, Mr. Reed?" she asked in a tone that made it clear saying no would be rude. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." Thomas put his notepad on the table but kept his camera strap around his neck. He noticed the children hanging around the doorway, watching him with obvious curiosity. "And who might you three be?" he asked, trying to break the tension. The oldest boy stepped forward with his shoulders straight. "I'm Samuel," he said. "This is my brother James and my sister Margaret." The younger children nodded but stayed quiet. Joseph Caldwell sat across from Thomas, folding his weathered hands on the table. "Now then, Mr. Reed, why don't you tell us what you've heard about our family that brought you all the way out here to Hollow Creek?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Well, sir, there's talk in town about the Caldwells. They say you've been here longer than anyone can remember. But yo." Eleanor put a cup of tea in front of Thomas. The china clinked softly against the saucer. "Sugar?" she asked. "No, thank you, ma'am." Thomas took a sip. The tea was burning hot and bitter. "They say the children have been children for longer than is natural." Samuel made a sound that might have been a laugh he was trying to hold back. His father gave him a warning look. "People talk," Joseph said simply, "especially in small towns where there's not much else to do." "Then there's no truth to it?" Thomas pressed. "Because I've talked to folks who say their grandparents knew your family, and they say you looked exactly the same then as you do now." Eleanor sat down beside her husband, sitting up very straight. "Mr. Reed, may I ask what year you were born?" The question surprised Thomas. 1925, he answered. "So you're 22, she said. "Young to be chasing fairy tales across the state." "With all due respect, Mrs. Caldwell, I'm not chasing fairy tales. I'm looking into an unusual story that could be very important scientifically if there's any truth to it." Joseph and Eleanor looked at each other in a way Thomas couldn't understand. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly in the silence that followed. "What if," Joseph said finally, "there was some truth to what you've heard? What would you do with that information, Mr. Reed?" Thomas leaned forward eagerly. "I'd write about it, of course. Could be the medical discovery of the century. Think of what it could mean if whatever affects your family could be studied and understood." "Studied?" Eleanor interrupted, her voice suddenly cold. "Like specimens in a laboratory?" "No, that's not what It's exactly what you mean," she said. "You'd have doctors and scientists coming to our home, disrupting our lives, treating us like curiosities rather than people." Thomas felt his reporter instincts getting sharper. They weren't saying it wasn't true. "So it is true," he said quietly. "You don't age." Joseph Caldwell's face stayed blank, but something flickered in his eyes. Maybe resignation or a deep tiredness. "Mr. Reed, we've lived in peace here for a very long time. We've hurt no one. All we ask is to be left alone." "But this could help all of humanity," Thomas argued. "If scientists could understand why you don't age." "You assume we don't know why," Joseph said. Thomas stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. You know what causes it?" Instead of answering, Joseph turned to his children. "Samuel, take your brother and sister outside. Go check on the chickens." "But Pa," Samuel started to protest. "Now, son." The children left reluctantly, the screen door slamming behind them. Eleanor got up and went to the window to watch them cross the yard. "Mr. Reed," Joseph said once the children were gone, "what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. Understood?" Thomas nodded eagerly, reaching for his notepad. "No," Joseph said firmly. "No notes, no story. This is for your ears only, and only so you understand why you need to leave us alone." Reluctantly, Thomas put his pencil down. All right, Mr. Caldwell. I'm listening. Joseph took a deep breath. My father, Jeremiah Caldwell, settled this land in 1817. He was a doctor trained in Philadelphia, but he got tired of city life. He came here with my mother, looking to start fresh and help the mountain people who had little access to medical care. 1817? Thomas interrupted. But that would make you. I was born in 1842, Joseph said matter-of-factly. I'm 105 years old, Mr. Reed. Thomas felt a chill despite the summer heat. If what Caldwell was saying was true, and he had no reason to think the man was lying, he was sitting across from someone who had lived through the Civil War, who had been an adult when Abraham Lincoln was president. My father was a good doctor, Joseph continued, but he was also a scientist at heart, always experimenting, always searching for ways to make human life better. He became obsessed with the idea of extending life, of conquering death itself. He paused, his gaze distant. In 1857, he believed he'd found something, a combination of local plants and minerals that, when processed a certain way, created what he called the elixir. Eleanor returned to the table, putting a hand on her husband's shoulder. Joseph, are you sure about this? He covered her hand with his own. He needs to understand, Eleanor. It's the only way. She nodded reluctantly and sat down again. My father tested the elixir on himself first, Joseph said. When he showed no bad effects, he gave it to my mother, to me, and to my younger sister, Rebecca. We didn't notice anything unusual at first, but as the years passed, it became clear that something had changed in us. By 1870, when I should have been showing signs of aging, I still looked like a man of 28. My father looked no older than he had the day he first took the elixir. And you haven't aged since? Thomas asked, struggling to believe what he was hearing. We age, Eleanor corrected, but very, very slowly. Maybe 1 year for every 15 or 20 that pass. Eleanor came to us in 1889, Joseph explained. She was the local school teacher, new to the area. We fell in love, and eventually I trusted her with our secret. She chose to take the elixir as well. And your children? Thomas asked. Joseph and Eleanor looked at each other again. They were born as normal children, Eleanor said carefully, but they inherited the effects. They age normally until around 12 years old, and then it slows dramatically. So how old are they really? Thomas couldn't help asking. Samuel was born in 1901, Joseph said. He's 46. James is 42. And Margaret? He paused, a shadow crossing his face. Margaret is our youngest, born in 1926. She's the only one who appears close to her actual age. Thomas's mind was spinning with questions. But how have you kept this secret for so long? Surely people would notice that you don't age. We move, Eleanor explained. Every 20 years or so, we sell the property, change our names, and move to another isolated area. Then, after a generation has passed, we sometimes come back. Human memory is short, Mr. Reed. Few people live in the same place their entire lives anymore. Those who do are often willing to dismiss what they see as impossible. But you said your father discovered this in 1857, Thomas pressed. That's 90 years ago. Why hasn't he published his findings? Why keep something so important a secret? Joseph's face darkened. My father did try to share his discovery once. In 1863, during the Civil War, he went to the Union Army, believing the elixir might help save wounded soldiers. He was naive. They didn't see a medical miracle. They saw a military advantage. They took his notes, held him for questioning, tried to force him to make more elixir. What happened? He escaped, Joseph said simply, came home and destroyed all written records of his work. He promised never to share the formula again, and made us promise the same. Where is he now? Your father. Dead, Eleanor answered before Joseph could speak. Some things the elixir cannot prevent. Disease still affects us. Jeremiah Caldwell died of tuberculosis in 1892. Thomas sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by what he was hearing. If it was true, and despite how fantastic it sounded, he was inclined to believe the Caldwells. He was sitting on the biggest story of the century, maybe the biggest story ever. "Mr. Reed," Joseph said, reading his thoughts, "you gave me your word that this conversation would stay private. But Mr. Caldwell, surely you see the potential benefit to mankind. If doctors could study your condition, recreate the elixir." "No." Joseph's tone was final. "I've seen what men do with power, Mr. Reed. I lived through the Civil War. I saw the trenches of France in the Great War. I watched as man split the atom and unleashed hell on earth in Japan just 2 years ago. Imagine what they would do with the power to extend life indefinitely." "Not everyone would misuse it," Thomas argued. "Think of the diseases that could be cured, the suffering that could be prevented. And think of the suffering that could be caused," Eleanor countered. "A world where only the wealthy and powerful live for centuries while the rest age and die as nature intended. A world of growing inequality, of resources strained beyond capacity by populations that never diminish." Thomas had no immediate answer to that. The ethical implications were indeed staggering. "There's more," Joseph said quietly. "The elixir comes with a price. We may not age, but we still feel the passage of time. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch everyone you know grow old and die, generation after generation? To form friendships knowing they're temporary from your perspective? To live in constant fear of discovery? It's a lonely existence, Mr. Reed. One I would not wish on others," Eleanor added softly. The sound of children's laughter came in through the open window, the Caldwell children coming back from their chores. Except they weren't children, Thomas reminded himself. Samuel was older than he was. James was old enough to be his grandfather. Only Margaret was truly a child. "What happens to them?" Thomas asked. "Your children. Will they live like this forever, moving from place to place, watching the world change around them while they stay the same?" "They have each other," Joseph said, though doubt crept into his voice. "And they have us. It's not the life we would have chosen for them, but it's the only one we can give them now." Thomas looked down at his untouched notepad, at the camera hanging around his neck. The story of a lifetime was sitting right in front of him. Proof of near immortality, a medical miracle hidden away in the Kentucky hills. His editor would promote him on the spot. His name would be known nationwide. And the Caldwells would be hunted relentlessly for the rest of their unnaturally long lives. "Mr. Caldwell," Thomas said slowly, "I understand your concerns, but this isn't something I can simply walk away from. The implications are too significant." Joseph's expression hardened. "I thought you might say that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small amber-colored bottle. "Do you know what this is, Mr. Reed?" Thomas stared at the bottle. "The elixir." Joseph nodded. "One of the last doses my father ever made. I've kept it all these years, though I've never been tempted to give it to anyone else." He placed the bottle on the table between them. "Take it." "What?" Thomas blinked in confusion. "Take it," Joseph repeated. "If you truly believe the world should have this knowledge, then you should be willing to live with the consequences yourself. Take the elixir. Experience what we've experienced. Then decide if humanity is ready for such a gift." Thomas looked from the bottle to Joseph's face, searching for signs of deception. "How do I know what's in there? It could be anything." Eleanor sighed. "Why would we poison you, Mr. Reed? If we wanted to harm you, we would never have invited you into our home or told you our story. Then why offer it to me at all?" "Because you need to understand," Joseph said earnestly. "Not just in your head, but in your heart. Words cannot convey what it means to live as we do. You must experience it yourself." Thomas stared at the bottle, its contents catching the late afternoon sunlight. The liquid inside was thick and dark, almost like molasses. The temptation was undeniable to never age, to potentially live for centuries. "What if I take it," he said slowly, "and still decide to write the story? Then at least you'll have made an informed decision," Joseph replied. "And you'll have to live with the chaos that follows. Not for a normal human lifespan, but potentially for centuries." The screen door creaked open and the Caldwell children came back into the kitchen. They fell silent when they saw the bottle on the table. Pa, Samuel said, his voice sharp with concern. It's all right, son, Joseph assured him. Mr. Reed and I are just having a discussion about choices and consequences. Samuel's gaze shifted to Thomas, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Despite his youthful appearance, there was something ancient in that gaze, something that had seen far more than a 12-year-old boy should have seen. Thomas picked up the bottle, rolling it between his fingers. The glass was warm to the touch, as if the liquid inside generated its own heat. If I take this, he said, how soon would I notice effects? The prevention of aging is gradual, Joseph explained. You wouldn't notice anything immediately, but the other effect is instantaneous. What other effect? Clarity, Eleanor said, a heightened awareness of time's passage. My father-in-law called it the long view, the ability to see beyond the immediate moment, to perceive the broader sweep of history. It sounded almost mystical, but Thomas was too captivated by the possibility to dismiss it. And there are no side effects? No drawbacks besides the emotional toll you mentioned. We can still be killed, Joseph said bluntly. Disease, injury, they affect us as they would anyone else. The elixir preserves youth. It doesn't grant invulnerability. Thomas uncorked the bottle. A faint scent of herbs and something metallic reached his nostrils. He had come to Hollow Creek looking for a story and found something far more profound, a moral dilemma disguised as a miracle. If he drank the elixir, he would be binding himself to secrecy more effectively than any promise could. If he refused, he would be walking away from the story of a lifetime. I need to think, he said, recorking the bottle and slipping it into his pocket. This isn't a decision to make lightly. Joseph nodded. A wise choice, Mr. Reed. Few in your position would hesitate. You'll stay for supper, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. It's nearly ready, and you've come a long way. Thomas glanced at his watch, surprised to find that it was already past 6 o'clock. The conversation had lasted longer than he'd realized. Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell. That's very kind. The meal that followed was surreal in its normalcy. Eleanor served fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and cornbread, a typical Kentucky supper. The children, despite their actual ages, behaved like the children they appeared to be, arguing over the last piece of chicken and asking to be excused to play before dark. Joseph spoke of the farm, of the tobacco crop, and the price of feed, as if he were any other farmer rather than a century-old man who had witnessed America's transformation from an agricultural society to an industrial superpower. As twilight deepened outside the windows, Thomas found himself relaxing despite the weight of the bottle in his pocket. There was something peaceful about the Caldwell home, something that transcended the incredible secret it contained. After dinner, Joseph invited Thomas onto the porch for a smoke. The night air was cooler now, a welcome relief from the day's heat. Fireflies blinked in the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. My father planted those oak trees, Joseph said, gesturing with his pipe toward the massive trees that lined the drive. They were saplings when I was a boy. Now look at them. Thomas tried to imagine watching trees grow from saplings to giants, living long enough to see forests mature and landscapes transform. It must be strange, he said, watching the world change while you remain the same. Joseph chuckled softly. Oh, we change, Mr. Reed. Not physically perhaps, but in here. He tapped his temple with the stem of his pipe. The mind continues to grow, to adapt. You either evolve with the times, or you become a relic regardless of how young you look. And the children, how do they cope with, well, with not being children? Joseph's expression grew somber. That's the hardest part. Samuel and James have lived through it before, the transition from being treated as children to accepting their adult minds. Margaret is just beginning to understand what makes her different. It's not easy for any of them. Have there been others? Thomas asked. Other families like yours? Joseph took a long draw on his pipe before answering. My father believed he wasn't the first to discover the principle behind the elixir. He found references in ancient texts, Egyptian, Chinese, even Native American, to substances that prolonged youth. Whether any succeeded as his did, I cannot say. They smoked in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Thomas felt the bottle in his pocket, a small weight with enormous significance. "You don't have to decide tonight," Joseph said eventually. "Take the elixir with you when you go. Think on it. But remember, once taken, it cannot be undone." Thomas nodded, though in truth, his decision was already forming. The story that had brought him to Hollow Creek was indeed extraordinary, perhaps the most important discovery in medical history. But the Caldwell's fears were not unfounded. In a world still reeling from the devastation of World War II, still grappling with the terrible power of atomic weapons, could humanity be trusted with the power to extend life indefinitely? "I should be going," Thomas said, rising from his chair. "It's a long drive back to Louisville." Joseph stood as well, extending his hand. "Whatever you decide, Mr. Reed, I hope you'll remember that we're not just a story. We're people trying to live our lives as best we can under unusual circumstances." Thomas shook the offered hand, struck by the strength in Joseph's grip. "I understand, Mr. Caldwell, more than you might think." Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "Leaving so soon? It's getting dark. You're welcome to stay the night." "Thank you, but I should get back," Thomas replied. "My editor is expecting me tomorrow." She nodded, though her eyes showed her concern. "Be careful on those mountain roads after dark. And Mr. Reed," she hesitated, "remember that knowledge, once shared, cannot be reclaimed." The children appeared behind her, lining up to say goodbye with a formality that seemed at odds with their youthful appearances. "Will you come back, Mr. Reed?" Margaret asked, her voice small but clear. Thomas smiled at her, wondering how it felt to be a 21-year-old woman trapped in the body of a 6-year-old girl. "Perhaps I will, Margaret. Would you like that?" She nodded solemnly. "I would. We don't get many visitors." "Then I'll do my best," he promised, though he wasn't sure if it was a promise he could keep. As Thomas drove away from the Caldwell farm, the headlights of his Ford cutting through the darkness, he found himself looking at the world with new eyes. The bottle sat on the passenger seat beside him, its contents gleaming faintly in the dashboard light. The elixir, the key to extended youth, possibly even a form of immortality. The ethical dilemma it presented was staggering. If he wrote his story, exposed the Caldwell secret to the world, he would be opening a Pandora's box that could never be closed again. Governments would fight for control of the elixir. The wealthy would hoard it. Society itself might fracture along new lines, the ageless versus the mortal. Yet to keep such knowledge hidden seemed equally wrong. What of the countless lives that might be improved or extended? What of the suffering that might be prevented? By the time Thomas reached the main road, his decision was made. He pulled over, cut the engine, and sat in the darkness for a long moment. Then he uncorked the bottle. The liquid inside was bitter, with an aftertaste of something he couldn't identify, something ancient and earthy. He drank it all in one swallow, then sat waiting, wondering if he would feel any different. First, there was nothing. Then, gradually, a strange clarity seemed to settle over his thoughts. It wasn't a physical sensation so much as a shift in perspective. The pressing concerns that had occupied his mind, his career, his reputation, the story he had come to find, suddenly seemed small and temporary against the vast backdrop of time. Thomas started the car again and continued toward Louisville, his mind racing with possibilities. He would not write the story, not as he had intended, at least. The risk to the Caldwells was too great, and the potential consequences for humanity too unpredictable. But perhaps there was another way to share this discovery, to explore its implications without exposing the Caldwell family. Perhaps, with time, and time was now a resource he would have in abundance, he could find a middle path between secrecy and revelation. As the lights of Louisville appeared on the horizon, Thomas Reed made a silent promise to the family he had left behind in Hollow Creek. He would protect their secret, but he would not let the knowledge die with them. Somehow, he would find a way to use what he had learned for the benefit of humanity without unleashing the chaos that Joseph Caldwell feared. It would be a delicate balance, a task that might take decades or even centuries to complete. But then, for the first time in his life, Thomas Reed had all the time in the world. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Dr. Martin Hargrove of the University of Kentucky Medical School received a peculiar package. Inside was a journal filled with notes on theoretical life extension, cellular regeneration, and aging prevention, all presented as hypothetical rather than proven science. There was no return address, only a note that read, "For when humanity is ready. Not yet, but someday." Dr. Hargrove read the journal with initial skepticism that quickly gave way to fascination. The theories presented were revolutionary, decades ahead of current medical understanding. Yet they were incomplete, tantalizingly close to a breakthrough, but missing key components that would make practical application possible. He spent weeks studying the journal, eventually bringing it to the attention of colleagues. Soon, a small team had formed to investigate the theories, publishing papers that would lay the groundwork for entirely new fields of medical research. None of them ever discovered the journal's source, though some noted the Louisville postmark. Nor did they connect it to the young journalist Thomas Reed, who had abruptly resigned from the Courier Journal that same autumn, citing a desire to explore broader horizons. Reed himself had vanished from Kentucky, leaving no forwarding address. Rumors suggested he had moved west, perhaps to California or Oregon. A few people claimed to have seen him years later, looking remarkably youthful for his age, but such sightings were dismissed as cases of mistaken identity. In Hollow Creek, the Caldwell family continued their quiet existence, tending their farm and keeping to themselves. Occasionally, a package would arrive from distant cities: books for the children, seeds for Joseph's garden, fabric for Eleanor's sewing. There was never a letter enclosed, never a return address, but they knew who sent them. And sometimes, on still summer nights when the fireflies danced in the yard and the whippoorwill called from the trees, Joseph Caldwell would sit on his porch and raise his pipe in silent salute to the journalist who had kept his word. The years passed. Decades turned to generations. The world changed around the Caldwell farm, but the family remained constant, moving occasionally as suspicions arose, always returning when memories had faded. Medical science advanced, spurred in part by the mysterious journal that had appeared in 1947. By the early 21st century, researchers had extended human lifespans significantly, though true agelessness remained elusive. The key components missing from the journal's formulas continued to baffle the scientific community. And in a small coastal town in Oregon, a man who appeared to be in his early 30s operated an antiquarian bookshop. He lived simply but comfortably, his shelves filled with first editions and historical texts spanning centuries. Locals knew him as a reclusive scholar with an uncanny knowledge of history, someone who spoke about past events as if he had witnessed them personally. Few noticed that he never seemed to age, that decade after decade his face remained unmarked by time. Those who did notice eventually died or moved away, their observations dismissed as impossible. The bookseller kept meticulous journals, recording the sweep of history as he witnessed it. And every few years, he would distill his observations into anonymous papers submitted to medical and scientific journals around the world, papers that nudged humanity closer to understanding aging without quite revealing the final secret. It was a delicate balance, this dance between revelation and concealment. But Thomas Reed had learned patience from the Caldwells. He could wait until humanity was ready for the gift and burden of extended life. And in the meantime, he watched and wrote and remembered the family in Hollow Creek who had trusted a young journalist with the secret of the ages. The mystery of the Caldwell family and their apparent agelessness persisted as local folklore in eastern Kentucky. Occasionally, ambitious reporters or curious scientists would venture into Hollow Creek, seeking the family that time forgot. But they found only abandoned farmhouses and suspicious locals who claimed no knowledge of any Caldwells. The truth remained hidden in plain sight, preserved in the memories of those who had drunk from the amber bottle, and in the pages of journals scattered across the country, fragments of a secret too profound to share, but too important to lose. And somewhere, perhaps in Kentucky or Oregon or some other quiet corner of America, the descendants of Jeremiah Caldwell's work lived on, watching the slow march of time with eyes that had seen more history than any textbook could contain, waiting for the day when humanity would be wise enough to accept the gift they had been given. In the archives of the Kentucky Historical Society, a photograph from 1947 shows a farmhouse surrounded by oak trees, with a family of 5 standing on the porch, Their faces are partially obscured by shadow, their identities lost to time. But if one looks closely at the corner of the image, a sixth figure can be seen. A young man with a camera around his neck, his expression caught between wonder and resolve. The caption reads simply, "Unidentified family, Hollow Creek, Kentucky, 1947. Photographer unknown." Some secrets, it seems, are destined to remain just beyond the reach of history, whispered about but never fully revealed, influencing the future in ways that even those who keep them cannot fully comprehend. And perhaps that is as it should be. In the summer of 1967, a young scientist named Dr. Elizabeth Chen discovered a curious pattern in the medical literature of the previous 20 years. Anonymous papers submitted from various locations across the country, all advancing similar theories about cellular regeneration and telomere preservation. The writing styles varied, but the underlying concepts connected like pieces of a puzzle with critical pieces still missing. Intrigued, Dr. Chun began tracking the papers, creating a map of submission locations and publication dates. The pattern suggested a single author moving systematically around the country, releasing information in carefully measured doses. Her investigation led her to a small town in Kentucky, where locals still told stories about the Caldwell family, the family that never aged. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, but Dr. Chun, with her scientific mind, saw the potential connection to the anonymous papers. After weeks of research, she located what she believed to be the original Caldwell property, now abandoned and overgrown. The farmhouse was collapsing under decades of neglect. In the ruins of what had once been a doctor's office, beneath rotting floorboards, she found a metal box containing fragmented notes in faded ink. The handwriting matched none of the anonymous papers she had studied, but the concepts were undeniably related. The notes were signed J. Caldwell, M.D. and dated 1857. Dr. Chun published her findings in a small medical journal, speculating about the connection between the 19th century doctor and the modern anonymous submissions. She suggested that someone had rediscovered Caldwell's work and was systematically releasing it to the scientific community. The paper attracted little attention at first. Then government officials arrived at her laboratory, taking away her research and making her promise to keep quiet under the National Security Act. The Caldwell investigation, they told her, had been classified since 1863, when Union Army officials had first encountered Jeremiah Caldwell's work on life extension. For over a century, a small division within what would eventually become the National Institutes of Health had been watching scientific literature for signs of the Caldwell formula resurfacing. Dr. Chen's paper had triggered long-dormant protocols. She was offered a position within this division, not as punishment, but as recognition of her insight. The government, it seemed, had been tracking the anonymous papers for years, but had never made the connection to the original Caldwell property. Dr. Chun accepted the position, driven by scientific curiosity. What she discovered in the classified archives both fascinated and disturbed her. The government had never obtained the complete elixir formula. Their attempts to recreate it based on Jeremiah Caldwell's partial notes had resulted in compounds that extended life marginally but caused severe side effects. More troubling were the files on the Caldwell family themselves. Surveillance reports spanning decades documented their movements across the country, their periodic returns to Kentucky, their apparent agelessness. The most recent file contained photographs from 1965, showing a family that matched descriptions from a century earlier, including a child who appeared to be 6 years old but was documented as having been born in 1926. The file also mentioned a companion who had joined the family in the late 1940s, a young man who had previously been a journalist in Louisville, Thomas Reed. When Dr. Chun questioned her superiors about why the government didn't simply approach the Caldwells directly, the answer was chilling in its practicality. Previous attempts had resulted in the family disappearing, sometimes for decades. The current policy was observation only, in hopes that the anonymous papers would eventually reveal the complete formula. "We've been patient for over 100 years, her supervisor explained. "We can wait a bit longer." But Dr. Chun wasn't satisfied with waiting. The scientific breakthrough represented by the elixir was too significant to leave in limbo. Using the government's resources, She began her own search for Thomas Reed, believing he might be more approachable than the Caldwells themselves. It took months of careful investigation, but eventually she traced him to a bookshop in Oregon. The owner, who called himself Thomas Blackwood, matched Reed's description but appeared far too young to be the same man, unless, of course, he had taken the elixir. In the autumn of 1968, Dr. Chun took a leave of absence and traveled to Oregon. The bookshop was exactly as described, a charming establishment specializing in rare historical texts. The owner, a handsome man who appeared to be in his early 30s, greeted her warmly. "How may I help you today?" he asked, his voice cultured and pleasant. Dr. Chun browsed the shelves, gathering her courage. Finally, she turned to him and said quietly, "I believe you're Thomas Reed, formerly of the Louisville Courier Journal." The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a weariness that hadn't been there before. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," he replied smoothly. "My name is Thomas Blackwood. I've never been to Louisville." "Mr. Reed," she persisted, "I'm not here on behalf of the government, though I should tell you they're aware of your existence. I'm a scientist. I've been studying the anonymous papers I believe you've been submitting to medical journals." The man said nothing, his face carefully neutral. "The Caldwell family," Dr. Chun continued. "Their secret, the elixir. I know about all of it." For a long moment, the bookshop was silent except for the ticking of an antique clock. Then Thomas sighed, a sound that seemed to contain decades of weariness. "How did you find me?" he asked finally. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "But once I understood what I was looking for, the pattern became clear." He nodded slowly, then moved to the front door, turning the sign to closed and drawing the blinds. "We should talk privately," he said, gesturing toward a back room. "This is not a conversation for public spaces." The back room was a cozy office lined with even more books. Thomas offered her a seat, then poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter. 21 years, he said, handing her a glass. "That's how long it's been since anyone connected me to Thomas Reed. I was beginning to think I'd covered my tracks well enough." "You did," Dr. Chun assured him. "But I had resources you couldn't have anticipated." "Government resources," he said, a statement rather than a question. She nodded. "They've been watching the Caldwells for over a century. They've collected every anonymous paper you've published, but they've never made the connection between the two. Until now." Thomas took a long sip of his whiskey. "They still haven't," she clarified. "That was my discovery alone, though I've had to share some of it with them." "And what do they intend to do with this information?" "Nothing for now. Their policy is observation only. They've learned from past mistakes." Thomas studied her face, his expression guarded. "And what do you intend to do, Dr. Chun?" "Elizabeth Chen." She set her glass down untouched. "I want to understand the papers you've been publishing. They're breadcrumbs, aren't they? Pieces of the puzzle released slowly over time." He smiled faintly. "You're very perceptive, Dr. Chun. But why? If you have the complete formula, why not share it all at once? Think of the lives that could be saved, the suffering that could be prevented." Thomas leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking much older than his apparent age. "Joseph Caldwell asked me the same question in reverse. When I wanted to publish the story immediately, he warned me about the harm that could be caused," he said. He shook his head. "We were both right in our ways." "So this is your compromise?" she asked. "Releasing the knowledge piece by piece? Over decades, over centuries if necessary," he corrected. "The breadcrumbs, as you call them, are carefully designed. Each advances scientific understanding incrementally, without making the final leap to the elixir itself. That leap won't come until humanity is ready for it." "And who are you to decide when humanity is ready?" Dr. Chun challenged. Thomas laughed softly. "I ask myself that question every day. I don't have a satisfactory answer yet. But consider the alternative, the elixir in the hands of governments, corporations, the wealthy elite. A world divided between the ageless and the mortal. Would that be better?" Dr. Chun had no immediate response. The ethical questions surrounding life extension were indeed complex, far beyond the simple scientific pursuit of knowledge. "The Caldwells," she said finally. "Are they still alive?" "Yes, though not in Kentucky anymore." Thomas smiled at some private memory. "Margaret is quite grown up now, though she still looks like a child. It's hardest for her, I think. Have you maintained contact with them?" He nodded. "We're careful, but yes. We've become something of an extended family over the years." "And the elixir itself, is it still being produced?" Thomas's expression closed off slightly. "Dr. Chun, you seem like a sincere person, but I've already said more than I should have. The location of the Caldwells, the current status of the elixir, these are not things I'm willing to discuss." She understood his caution, but pressed on. "What if we could work together? My scientific knowledge combined with your understanding of the elixir. We could advance the research significantly, perhaps find a way to make it safe for wider distribution." "Safe?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "The elixir is physically safe. It's the psychological and societal implications that concern me." "Then let's study those too," she urged. "Controlled trials, ethical frameworks, regulatory guidelines. We could prepare the ground for an eventual release. Ensure it benefits humanity broadly rather than a privileged few." Thomas regarded her thoughtfully. "You're very passionate about this." "I'm a scientist," she said simply. "The pursuit of knowledge is my life's work. And if that knowledge could destroy more than it creates, then we contain it until we find a better solution. But doing nothing, hiding the truth entirely, that's not a solution either." Thomas was silent for a long moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost resigned. "I've lived with this secret for 21 years, he said. "The Caldwells have lived with it for over a century. The burden is substantial. Sometimes I think Joseph was right that humanity will never be ready. Other times I see the advances we've made, the potential for growth and wisdom, and I hope." "Hope is essential," Dr. Chun said. "Without it, why bother advancing science at all?" A smile touched Thomas's lips. "A fair point." He set down his glass and leaned forward. "I won't give you the formula, Dr. Chun. Not yet. But I will share something else with you, a theoretical framework for understanding how the elixir affects cellular regeneration. It's more than I've shared in any of the anonymous papers. Consider it a test." "A test of what?" "Of whether partial knowledge can be handled responsibly. Publish your findings based on what I give you. Let's see how the scientific community and the government responds." It wasn't everything she had hoped for, but it was a start. "I can work with that," she agreed. Thomas rose and moved to a hidden wall safe behind one of the bookshelves. From it, he withdrew a thin manuscript bound in leather. "This contains observations and theories I've developed over the past 2 decades, he explained, handing it to her. "It's incomplete by design, but it's genuine." Dr. Chun accepted the manuscript with reverence, understanding its significance. "Thank you for trusting me with this." "Trust is earned," he replied. "This is merely the beginning of that process." As she prepared to leave, a question occurred to her. The government files mentioned a young girl, Margaret, born in 1926 but still appearing as a child in the 1960s. How does she cope with that existence? A shadow crossed Thomas's face. "With difficulty," he admitted. "The elixir's greatest curse is the disconnect between appearance and experience. Margaret has the mind of a woman in her 40s trapped in a child's body. She can never have a normal life, never form relationships with people her own age. It's lonely." The human cost of extended youth suddenly became clearer to Dr. Chun. The scientific marvel of the elixir had a deeply personal impact on those who lived with its effects. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "that's another area we could research, finding ways to help people like Margaret navigate their unique existence." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps." He walked her to the door. "I'll be watching for your publication, Dr. Chun, and I'll know if you share more than we've agreed." "I understand." She extended her hand. "This won't be the last time we meet, Mr. Reed." He took her hand, his grip firm despite his scholarly appearance. "No," he agreed. "I don't believe it will be." As Dr. Chun left the bookshop and stepped into the Oregon sunshine, she felt the weight of the manuscript in her bag and the greater weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She had sought answers and found only more questions about science, ethics, and the very nature of human existence. The elixir was both miracle and burden, gift and curse. Understanding its complexities would take more than scientific inquiry. It would require wisdom that perhaps only came with the passage of time. And time, it seemed, was something Thomas Reid had in abundance. In the decades that followed, Dr. Elizabeth Chun became a leading figure in longevity research, her papers building upon the theoretical framework Thomas had provided. She never revealed her source, attributing her insights to previously unpublished research she had discovered. The government watched her work with interest but never intervened directly. The anonymous papers continued to appear in scientific journals, now complementing rather than preceding her own publications. And in a small Oregon coastal town, a bookshop changed hands every 20 years or so, always passing to a new owner who bore a striking resemblance to the previous one. Locals noticed the similarity but thought little of it. Just another family business passed down through generations. The secret of the Caldwells and of Thomas Reid remained hidden in plain sight, influencing the course of medical science without ever revealing itself completely. A mystery wrapped in the pages of history, waiting for the day when humanity would be ready to turn the final page.